You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Professor Jonathan Fox. He's in the Department of Political Studies and the Faculty of Social Sciences at Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel. We're going to talk about religious minorities, when and how they are discriminated against, and their conflict behavior. So, Jonathan, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I guess to start with, if you could give me a little bit of background on yourself, and then we'll talk about the current research you're doing.
Sure. I'm originally from Chicago, but after receiving my PhD at the University of Maryland in 1997, I took a job in Israel at Bar-Ilan University, which is located at Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. Pretty much all my research is focused on religion and politics in some manner. I've looked at religious minorities, government and religion policy, religious conflict, the Huntington civilizations debate, religion and international relations, various points in time. But most of my recent research is focused on religious minorities, at least for the time being.
Okay. Are you studying current situations that are going on right now in the world, or historical ones that have recently happened? Like, where are you drawing the conflict knowledge from?
I run a project called the Religion and State Project, and it's an empirical project. What we do is we collect data, what's happening pretty much everywhere in the world. The project includes 183 countries, which is every country in the world with at least 250,000 people living in it, a few smaller countries. When we focus on minorities, it includes 771 minorities in these countries, which is every minority that's at least 0.2% of the population of the country, plus smaller minorities, particularly Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but also some other smaller minorities in many countries. The data set currently covers 1990 to 2014, but we're gearing up to update the data through 2022. That'll be a process that'll take several years. It's a thousands and thousands of hours of work. So my research is based around that data rather than looking at one particular country and the dynamics. We look for trends across countries, correlations, connections, many of which you probably wouldn't find if you're looking at a particular country. But when you look at the trends across many minorities, what causes what doesn't cause what, you very often find some things that are extremely surprising.
It's a question I ask quite often. What kind of surprising things have you found? What are some interesting insights?
Well, one of the most recent ones, this is an article that's going to be coming out, I guess, sometimes in 2023 in the American Political Science Review. We found that most people would expect that when governments support a religion, they're doing so because they expect supporting a religion will boost the government's legitimacy. There are other things they're looking for, and there are other reasons to support a state religion. But that is one of the big ones, according to pretty much every theory ever written on the topic. It turns out, at least in Christian majority countries, the more a government supports a religion, the less legitimate they are.
That's weird. Why do you think that is? Why would there be this opposite
Okay, well, keep in mind,
closer?
our legitimacy variable is actually, we merged the data on what's going on in a broader sense of the country with polling data taken from the World Values Survey. So the data, we're actually looking at trust in government, which we use to measure legitimacy, and it's a good measure of legitimacy, but it's trust in government. I think a few things are going on. First of all, there's a growing trend where, well, you have to look at both. Why would a secular person feel this way, and why would a religious person feel this way? Well, a secular person, political secularism, we can define as somebody who believes that government should be staying out of religion in some manner. It's a very simple one. And many different people who call themselves secular have very different specific beliefs about that. But most of them would agree that they would like government to be out of religion. So obviously those people would not be happy with the government supporting a religion. But we find religious people are feeling the same way. And we think a few things are going on. People are at least in the Western world, are becoming a bit more sophisticated about their understanding of religion and government. And there are a few things going on. One of them is people are beginning to understand that when a government supports a religion, it also has a certain element of control. Take, for example, if a government gives money to a religion, the religion then becomes dependent on that money in order to operate and in order to have its institutions run, keep the lights on, build places of worship, whatever they're doing with the money. And because the fact is, religion is not free. You want a religious institution, it's a building, it's got people working there, they have electricity, you got to call the exterminator if there's a problem with cockroaches. All these things cost money, and somebody has to pay for it. Now, if the government's paying for it, well, that's really nice because it's cheap to the worshipers, but it also means anytime a government gives money to anything, whether it's religion or not, they have the power to tell those institutions to which they're giving money what to do. Or if you don't do what the government wants, they take away the support. And that gives a certain amount of control. Other aspects of government support for religion all in some way give the government more say over what's going on in a religion than a lot of religious people would like. A colleague of mine, Lenny Kuhl in Denmark, documented how the Nordic governments all forced their state churches to change their doctrines on core issues like gay marriage and whether females can be priests. Now, I'm not taking a position on those. I'm not taking an issue. I don't take a position on those issues. I'm not telling the Norwegian Lutheran Church who can be a priest or who that they can be married. That's really not my concern. But a lot of religious people don't like the government, the parliament, actually telling the government what their theology can be. And I think religious people are beginning to understand that and sort of prefer that their religion be independent, even if it might cost them a little more money out of their pocketbook.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure to some religions, those are probably huge issues.
Huh. Yeah. And again, it's like, I'm not taking a position on that issue, but if you don't like those decisions, you certainly don't like the government forcing them upon your church.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Huh. I guess it goes back to, I don't know if it's a saying, but if you accept money from somebody, then they can tell you what to do, at least in some part.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed the TV show Mad Men, and there was a point in time on the show where they sold the agency to, I think it was a British company, I don't remember. And the old guy who was the senior guy in the company said, well, we took their money. Now they get to tell us what to do. And that's basically how it works. You take government money, they get to tell you what to do. Some people don't like that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Who approaches who in these cases? If you have a minority religion, do they approach the government or does the government approach them? And it seems like a friendly, helpful thing at first, but it turns ugly. Like what happens?
Well, this particular research wasn't really about minority religions. This was really more about how state support religion affects people's opinions about government. It didn't particularly involve minorities. This was one of my studies in government religion policy.
Right. Have you conducted a study that would answer that kind of question?
It's minorities in general are not happy. The minorities in general are not happy with government support for religion because in most cases, the majority religion is getting preferential treatment, and they would prefer to get the same level of support if the government's giving out support. And more often than not, that's not the case. So that's a relatively simple thing to check, and that's pretty much what we found. But that was not particularly surprising.
I mean, so is it that a major religion that a lot of people believe in has a lot more clout and therefore the government can't interfere with it, or it just chooses not to because it would just cause literally an uprising? Like why would a major religion be okay?
Okay, from the minority, we're talking about different perspectives. Many religious people don't like the government supporting their religions. And we're talking about, say, let's talk going back to our Nordic example, say a religious Norwegian doesn't like government support for the Norwegian Lutheran Church, which was until I think 2017 the National Church of Norway. They disestablished, if I remember correctly, it was effective January 1, 2017. So I actually was there not too long after that happened, and I talked to people, and a lot of them were and they were trying to decide, what are we going to do now that we've disestablished the church? How is the government going to regulate religion? Because in Norway, they regulate everything. And it was very interesting because some of the religious people who were there were saying, we'd like the government to completely stay out of it, stop funding the church. We'll find our own money somehow and let the church be independent. And people who were more secular were actually saying, no, they want the government to keep giving money to the church and other religions for that matter, because how else are we going to keep those people in line? They were quite upfront about that.
I guess even regular folks see it as a measure of control that they wanted. Interesting.
Okay, well, the people I was talking to were people, government officials and academics at a conference, so I'm not really sure you'd call this your average person on the street, but these were the intellectuals who were debating what the policy would be.
So what do you think the implications of this kind of behavior is? Is it universal in the data that you see, or is it confined to only a few countries?
Well, by definition, when you're running tests, looking at as many countries as possible, looking for trends, these trends are widespread. But in the social sciences, to every rule, there is an exception. You're looking at trends, you're looking at probabilities, you're looking at things like normal curves. So this tends to be the trend, but there are always going to be exceptions. And please don't ask me which country is an exception, because it's actually very difficult to suss out, because every country is an exception in a few respects, but more often than not tends to follow the trends in more respects than they don't.
Well, is there an example of a country or a set of countries where the behavior was so strange it made you scratch your head? It just was out of line with what you normally see?
On this particular trend, you would never even notice this trend unless you run tests across 40, 50 countries with 1,000 respondents from each country. It's a trend you wouldn't even see unless you did that. So it's almost impossible to pick out a country that doesn't fit the trend. This is one of those, when you do a big picture analysis, sometimes it's very difficult to look at the little picture unless you want to get into a very deep long-term study. And other people do. The country-focused studies are very important. That's just not what I do. There are other people who do that.
What about countries where, let's say, the predominant religion is Christianity, and you have a minority Muslim population versus the vice versa? Majority Muslim, minority Christian.
The behavior in Muslim majority countries, one of the things I found is the trends can be very different across majority traditions. I don't know what the trends are in Muslim majority countries for this particular finding, mostly because there weren't enough surveys done in enough countries for the rules statistics to apply. When you have too few cases and too little variation on a variable, 2 or 3 countries' idiosyncrasies can drive a trend. So it's impossible to run the numbers. So I'm pretty sure based on what we've run that the trends are different in Muslim majority countries, but I couldn't say with any certainty what the trends are.
Well, what do you see when, I guess in Christian-led countries, how are various religious minorities treated? Are some treated better than others, or worse than others?
Oh, definitely. Well, if we're going to move on to how are minorities treated, you have to understand something. Discrimination against religious minorities by governments is the norm. Close to 90% of the countries in the world engage in discrimination against religious minorities. This is true across all religious traditions: Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, whatever you like. It happens. And when countries discriminate, they almost always discriminate against different minorities differently. That's the rule. Rather, the only countries that don't discriminate differently are the ones that engage in extremely low levels or no discrimination. Once discrimination reaches even more than just the lowest levels, you almost always have some minorities getting it worse than others. And that's true across the Muslim world and the Christian world.
Well, what does it look like? What does this discrimination by governments look like? I know it's different in different countries, but.
Okay, well, first of all, but by discrimination, now I'm talking about a variable I specifically measure. And like I said, we measure this different for each of the 771 minorities, which would say be Muslims in England are measured differently than Muslims in France, which are measured differently than Jews in France. It's basically a minority within a country. So there are many Muslim minorities. I don't remember the number, but it's probably over 100. There's 76 Jewish minorities in the data set, and so on. So we're looking at two variables. We're looking at discrimination by governments and discrimination by society. Discrimination by governments, what we look at is restrictions on religion itself, restrictions on religious institutions, restrictions on clergy, restrictions on religious practices. A common one is restrictions on the ability to build, rent, or maintain a place of worship, for example. So say you're a Muslim minority somewhere in Europe and you want to build a mosque. Well, there are no countries in Europe that ban building mosques, but Muslims in Europe very often tend to run up against zoning regulations when they're trying to build a mosque in a way that other religions don't. So local governments are basically using zoning regulations, building permits, things like that to block building of mosques without actually saying we're not letting anybody build a mosque. But when you look at the behavior, it's very clear that the Muslims are being treated differently than, say, for example, Jews, or say a Christian minority, which would be a Christian group that's not the same denomination as the majority in the country. Say if you're in Spain, which is majority Catholic, if you were Protestant.
Do they call any of this soft versus hard discrimination? Are there different particular levels and, again, ways of discriminating that are commonplace?
I guess you could use those terms. Those aren't terms that I generally use in my research because we're a bit more precise about it. We have scalings for each of these variables that would more take into account how often does this happen, how much of the country does it happen. Like, say, for example, in most countries in Europe, you can build a mosque. There are mosques, so it's not an absolute ban, but there can be difficulties. So that would be somewhere to the low mid-range of the scale if you had a case like that. So we're actually scaling it with numbers, and we're using the numbers that get plugged into a statistics program to actually look for correlations. So calling it hard or soft is not useful if you're using a statistical package.
Yeah, what are some of the other discrimination methods that you've seen?
Well, we measure 36 of them, and we probably don't have time to go through all of them. But some common ones, the restrictions on places of worship are common. A very common one is registration. In many countries, probably the majority of countries in the West, religions are required to register as religions, not as a charitable or general charitable organization. There's actually a specific registration process for religions. There are laws on what criteria you have to meet to be able to register. And in a lot of countries, the bar is set very high, and it's set that way apparently for the purpose of keeping some religions out from being recognized. Now that alone can cause problems because when you're not recognized by the state, you're not getting benefits some religions might get, such as, say, non-taxable status as a charitable organization. But sometimes there are government benefits handed out to religions, and you wouldn't be getting that. In some cases, it's actually illegal to engage in a whole bunch of religious practices unless you're a registered religion. So a government can claim we have complete religious freedom for all religions in the country, but that they mean all registered religions, and they don't let a lot of religions register. So they're in effect blocking a lot of free practice of religion while claiming they are religiously free. It's a popular tactic in autocratic governments. We see it a lot in countries that are Orthodox Christian. It's very common in those countries, but not just them. This is also something that's going on in, say, countries like Hungary, which is not an Orthodox Christian country.
Interesting. Why do you think governments engage in some of this behavior? What are some of the motivations? Would it make certain politicians look good if they stand with a certain religion? Like, what are those reasons?
Well, that goes back to the legitimacy argument. But I'll give you a list of the big 4 or 5 or 6 that seem to be there. There are a lot of idiosyncratic motivations. The bigger ones are ideology. For example, Rodney Stark, a very prominent sociologist of religion who passed away not too long ago. I might get the quote slightly wrong, but he said something along the lines of, those who believe in the one true God are jealous of the worship of other gods. And that's the classic religious motivation. You believe in the wrong religion, we don't like you, and we don't want to let you do that. It basically comes down, that's the classic religious ideology for blocking religious minorities. That motivation is there in the West, but it's not as strong as it might be in the Muslim world. And please keep in mind, the Muslim world is very diverse. There are a number of Muslim countries, particularly in West Africa, that are far more tolerant of religious minorities than your average Western democracy. And you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are incredibly intolerant of many religious minorities. There's a very wide spectrum, just as there is in the Christian world. A related motivation is the one you referred to. It's called in literature the religious monopoly motivation. Governments gain benefits, according to the argument, for supporting a religion. If they support a religion, they get benefit. That religion brings benefits back to them. It might increase social trust. The argument was it increased legitimacy, although that doesn't seem to be the case more recently, based on the data I have. Religions engage in all sorts of charitable work within society that they may be able to do more efficiently than government. So the government gains a lot of benefits, but what the religion wants in return is a monopoly. They want to be the dominant religion in society, and pretty much everybody agrees you can't have a religion that's beyond a certain level of dominance, beyond demography, without government repressing religious minorities. So you get the same result as you do from the ideology argument, but in this case, the ideology is coming from the religion, and the political leaders are simply doing it in order to get the religious institutions to play ball with them and support the government. On the other side of the spectrum, secularism, especially in its anti-religious variant, is a very strong motivation for discrimination against religious minorities. Now, you would think secularists wouldn't like any religion. But what actually happens in countries with strong secularist influences, it increases the level of discrimination against religious minorities. And I think there are 2 mechanisms going on. One of them is there are many motivations for discriminating against religious minorities, some of which have nothing to do with religion. And once a government's already motivated, the secularist impulse will exacerbate issues. Meaning, if you're already discriminating against religion and you don't like religion anyway, the not liking religion will make things worse. The other thing going on is a lot of discrimination coming from secular quarters is dislike by people who believe in specific manifestations of secular ideology of specific religious practices. Take, for example, kosher or halal slaughter. Kosher or halal slaughter is how Jews or Muslims slaughter animals in a ritual way, and that's what makes kosher meat kosher and halal meat halal. Animal rights activists many of them believe animals shouldn't be slaughtered at all, but if they're going to be slaughtered, there's a certain stunning process that should be done where the animals are stunned. The problem is, if you stun the animals in that manner, it's impossible to do kosher or halal slaughter. So they argue that basically those religious practices are primitive and they're from ancient times, and the Jews and Muslims just got to get with the times and change their practices in order to be in line with this new understanding of how animals should be slaughtered. So it's basically you have a secular ideology demanding that religion conforms to the secular beliefs in a way that's really not at all dissimilar from a religious government asking people who don't believe in the religion to conform to their religious beliefs.
Well, which ones appear to be more demanding upon the minorities or the secular people, or the the religions that are not the main one, or
the interesting thing about this is I found this seems to be concentrated in Western Europe, these types of secular movements, and they're largely focused on three religious practices that happen to be common to Jews and Muslims. There's the animal slaughter issue, there's infant male circumcision, and there's the issue of female modesty, particularly as it manifests in women covering their hair and their heads. And all of these violate certain secular beliefs. And again, to say all secular people believe the same thing would be similar to saying all religious people believe the same thing. But there's strong trends within that community that really do not like these practices and seek to restrict them. And almost all examples of those restrictions you can find in Western Europe, and to some extent other EU countries that were part of the former Soviet bloc.
Yeah, very interesting work. Any ideas on what you're going to see in the 2014 to 2022 data? I would guess with COVID restrictions worldwide, that'll be a whole new wealth of data for you.
Well, and until you actually start collecting the data, you never know for sure. But based on just what I get from just having a general idea of what's going on in the world, the trend from 1990 to 2014 was a general rise in discrimination against religious minorities. And I don't think that trend is going to stop. I believe it's going up. I could be wrong until you actually collect the data across hundreds of minorities, across another, I guess, 2004, I guess we're adding another 8-9 years. You don't know until you actually check and do the thousands of hours of work, country by country, collecting the information and turning it into codable data. So I like to keep an open mind, because even if I have a good idea what to expect, I can guarantee you I won't be more than 80 or 90% correct.
That's a pretty high level, and it's pretty hard to get anything higher than that, higher certainty.
True, so. But the 10 or 20% that I miss will be that I'm not expecting will be what's particularly interesting. And I could be a lot less than 80 or 90. Again, you never know until you go and collect the information. And like I said, we're gearing up to start collecting it, but it's not going to even start at the earliest till this summer, and it takes several years to collect. So if you want a definitive answer, call me in about 4 years.
Oh wow, long time.
It's it's just a lot of man hours of research assistant time, supervising the research assistants. We're gathering the money and assembling a team. That's basically what we're doing now.
How is the information used to affect policy or to understand what's going on in the world? I mean, what are you going to do with the info you collected and interpreted?
Well, I'm an academic, so I'm really interested in understanding what's going on in the world, and I tend to do that through academic publications. But through my publications, I tend to reach a good number of policymakers. The data that I have, which is well known in the academic field, is beginning to be recognized more among policymakers in Western countries, at least. And running the numbers and figuring out what's going on and being able to demonstrate I have evidence-based information on what's going on is what gives me the credibility that once I've done all the work, I've collected all the data, I've analyzed the results, that's what gives me the credibility to talk to policymakers and tell them what's going on.
And do you feel like you've been able to change policy in any countries in a good way with the research?
It's really hard to tell. I have interacted with policymakers and I've given them the information, but the thing is, it's very difficult to make policy recommendations because it really depends what you want. Like, for example, I mentioned I was in Norway not too long after, at the invitation of the government. not too long after they disestablished their church and were trying to figure out how to deal with things. And they weren't that interested in asking me what their policy should be, because there are many policies you can pick that would be appropriate. And every country in the world has a different policy, and they have to pick what's right for their country. I don't know what's right for Norway, and I certainly don't know what's right for Norway more than a Norwegian would. What I can help them with is understand the consequences of a policy they might pick. And any state religion policy that you pick is going to have its pluses and minuses. There are things you're going to like, and there are things you're not going to like. And what you're going to like and not like depends on what your preferences are. So I can give good advice. What are the consequences of policies? But deciding what policy is right for a country is not something I'd want to do, even if I could.
Is there a certain trend on where policies are headed by various governments? Do you see things evolving in a certain direction?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The policy is evolving towards governments being more involved in religion. They're supporting it more. They're also regulating it more, and they're also engaging in more discrimination. Now, not all governments are moving in that direction, but for every one that is moving in the other direction, say less support, less discrimination, less regulation, there are probably about 3 that are moving towards more support, regulation, and discrimination. And this trend is across world regions, across majority religions. This is not specific to, it's not being driven by any one part of the world or any one identifiable demographic.
Are there, are there accelerants to this, or things that slow it down once a policy is in place from a government in regards to a particular religion? Like, let's say a new minority religion just obtains its status. How will it be treated early on versus later?
That's not something I've really studied that closely, although that's a very interesting question that is worthy of study. Because again, I'm looking at the larger thing. But what tends to happen with government religion policy is I'm giving the impression this is moving like an avalanche. It really moves more like a glacier. Government religion policy, most countries don't change it very often. This is not something they change every year in most cases. If you look, the period I have looked at is a 25-year period. Most countries that have changed their policy in some manner will have done so 1, 2, maybe 3 times for different policies over this period of 25 years. So if you look at any given year to the next year, most countries will be the same. But if you look at a longer span of time, there is movement, and it's very clear movement in a certain direction. But again, it's more like a glacier than an avalanche.
What about the current? I don't know. It looks like maybe the breakdown of globalism. How do you think that's going to manifest in rules and regulations and treatment of minorities, religious minorities worldwide?
I'm not really sure how much globalization influences that in the first place, other than globalizations cause more movements of populations, so you have more minorities in countries than you used to. But the issues tend to be the same. Going back to the causes of discrimination, one of the bigger causes that's in the not necessarily religious category is many governments are very protective of their local culture. So religious minorities that have a long history in the country will very often be treated quite decently and have a lot of privileges, and there won't be a large amount of discrimination against them, but they very much don't like new religions that they consider different and non-indigenous coming in, and will restrict those heavily. And you see that particularly among the religions that are very heavily engaging in missionary activities. This includes Muslims, and this includes a lot of North American Christian denominations, and of course the Mormons.
Okay. Well, very good, Jonathan.
So for example, like in if you have traditional Protestants in many countries will be treated fine, but when the Baptists and Pentecostals come in, they will get slammed. That would be an example.
Do any of the other, do any religious groups that are favored or are left alone? Do they gang up on the minority religions with the government? Does it change the attitudes of the general populace you've seen when government puts in regulation against a certain religion?
You very often see efforts in groups that try and do cross-religious toleration. I haven't seen a lot that affecting government policy very much.
But do you see that the government policy manifests itself in like everyday interactions between people? When does it trickle down, or does it?
Well, that's a difficult question. The types of things I measure are really more government policies that restrict religious institutions and religious practices. To get down to what goes on day to day on the street with people, you'd be better off sending a sociologist or an anthropologist to do a case study on, say, a particular town or even a particular church. And there are many people doing that, but that's not what I'm doing. And I haven't seen a lot of them focusing the influence of the macro on the micro. They just tend to focus on the micro. And that's probably a type of cooperation we should be doing better, but we're not.
Well, very good. Jonathan, what's the best way for people to find out more about your research and your data? Where can they go?
Well, if you want to look at the Religion and State Project, we have a website, www.religionandstate.org. It's really an academic website designed just for people to get to the data, see what academic publications are out there on it. But if you want to play with the data online and see how it manifests in some specific countries, it's integrated into the Association of Religion Data Archives project, which has the website of www.thearda.com. And you can also access my data through them. They have country profiles where you can see a lot of the data in the country profiles. And they also have a lot of very good information on religion in general, all sorts of data and interesting stuff, and a lot of which you can actually work with and do some basic searching online through the data. Okay. And if you'd like to read my books, you can find a copy of my CV on my university website, which has a complicated name, but if you Google my name and Bar-Ilan University, it should pop right up.
Very good. Okay. Well, Professor Jonathan Fox at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. So thank you, Jonathan, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.